Battlefield 4 released in late 2013 during a critical transition between console generations. It entered the fray with immense expectations. Coming off the classic that was Battlefield 3, DICE sought to refine the formula, push the boundaries of what the game could be, and fully commit to the scale and chaos that had become the series' hallmark. It was also the first Battlefield game to launch on the new next-gen consoles at the time, and allowed console players to play on 64-player lobbies for the very first time. But Battlefield 4 had a disastrous launch, not on the same scale as Battlefield 2042, but still a bad one enough that many players remember it to this day. The launch was infamously plagued with game-breaking bugs, server crashes and technical instability. For months it was considered a mess, leading to widespread frustration amongst the Battlefield community, yet unlike many of its contemporaries that fizzled out post-launch, especially the last few entries in the franchise, Battlefield 4 clawed its way back. Through rigorous patches, updates and content additions, it not only redeemed itself, but evolved into what many now regard as one of, if not the best Battlefield games ever. I loved Battlefield 1 and I think it's an amazing game, but for me personally, Battlefield 4 was the last Battlefield game where I simply couldn't stop playing it. And there is a reason why people constantly bring it up when discussing what the next Battlefield game should be like. Because it got a lot of things right. But let's not forget that it also wasn't without its faults. And in this video I want to take a look back at all the good and bad things about Battlefield 4 and what made it so good. The multiplayer is what Battlefield games have always been about, and at launch Battlefield 4 had 10 multiplayer maps that ranged in scope, from urban maps to open deserts, dense forests and islands. You had maps like Lansing Dam or Goldmund Railway, which were suited for more vehicular warfare, then Flood Zone and Zavod, which were a mixture of both infantry and vehicular gameplay, and of course the deep dark hallways of Operation Get Fucking Airburst in the Face Locker. Each map offered something different and provided a good variety to choose from. The mode offerings in Battlefield 4 also contributed to the diversity of its multiplayer. Conquest remained the main mode, but you also had other game modes such as Obliteration, Rush, Domination and Team Deathmatch, and many more. Whether you preferred bigger maps on Conquest or just wanted to jump on for a few games on TDM, the game had both of those experiences and, like I said, many more to offer. Obliteration in particular introduced an exciting new rhythm of attack and defence as it was basically search and destroy. Although some modes were more niche and rarely populated, especially in later years, the game's wide variety of game modes meant that there was something for everyone. Classes were a central part of the gameplay, as they always have been and as they always should be. You had your assault, support, recon and engineer. Each class had specific weapons locked to their respective class. Assault had assault rifles, support LMGs, recon snipers and engineers SMGs, but shotguns, carbines and DMRs were made available to all classes too, offering a little bit of versatility when it came to weapon choice so that you weren't completely locked into using guns from one specific category. And whilst we're on the topic of guns, let's talk about gunplay, the most important mechanic when it comes to an FPS game. Personally, I still preferred Battlefield 3's gunplay over 4's, but it was still pretty good and enjoyable. My biggest issue, and this is probably just a personal preference, is that I feel like 70% of the guns all felt the same to handle and control. Battlefield 4 weapons had quite a lot of spread when firing continuously, and the only way to control that spread was through microbursting, which meant that every weapon felt similar to use. I still enjoyed it, but it was also frustrating at times, especially when you were being suppressed and had the accuracy of Stevie fucking Wonder. But even then, I think it's better than the gunplay in Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5, and most definitely better than 2042. Customization was also the best the franchise has seen in my opinion. There was a huge amount of weapon covers to unlock and choose from, and also a good variety of skins for each character. The most important thing was that skins stuck to the identity and themes the game was going for. You didn't have no Mass Effect skins running around or Captain fucking Birdseye. All of the skins that were available elevated the immersion slightly more rather than break it. Something that most shooters now suffer from is a lack of identity and sticking to the setting the game is set in. Battlefield itself has fallen victim to this trend. However, Battlefield 4 stuck to it throughout its whole cycle, and the sheer amount of camos, knives and weapons make it the best customization system in any Battlefield game. The amount of attachments available for your weapons were also great, with many options to choose from, whether that was different sights, barrels, suppressors, grips. There was a lot to experiment with, but as is always the case, there were certain attachments that were better than others, but the sheer variety was still nice for those who didn't want to go with the same weapons and attachments that everyone else was using. Battlefield 4 tried to build on its predecessor's destruction system. It wanted to go bigger and better, and so they introduced Levolution. It served as an interactive event that would change the way the map would play. The tower on Siege of Shanghai could be taken down, a ship could crash on Paracel Storm, or the streets would flood on Flood Zone, bringing the fight to the rooftops. It was great for promotional purposes, and initially it was groundbreaking, especially on next-gen consoles. However, it quickly became somewhat of a gimmick that at times worked as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it looked incredible and played into the massive cinematic spectacle the Battlefield was known for, but on the other hand, it actually damaged the way some of the maps flowed after the event was triggered. Siege of Shanghai, in my opinion, suffered the most. The tower in the middle of the map was where all the players would funnel into, and either camp those damn elevators or fight for your life on the rooftop whilst you're constantly being killed by a nightbird. And after that tower collapses, that area of the map simply isn't as fun to play anymore. Now, you could argue that it meant players would then go and fight in different areas, but the issue was that the other areas weren't that fun to fight in. And of course, this wouldn't be a Battlefield game without vehicles, and personally I think Battlefield 4 had the best vehicular gameplay of all the Battlefield games. And in my opinion, they were fairly balanced for the most part. Now, a well coordinated heli or a really good jet pilot or even a tank player could still be a pain in the ass, but they could also be easily taken down if a few engineers got together and focused on them. Tanks were powerful in the right hands, but could also be easily taken down. One thing I think goes unnoticed is just how many transport vehicles are available around the map, something that I think some of the newer games have suffered from. I've never really had an issue with finding a jeep or a quad. They always seem to be in and around the objective, and that's something that is missing in the other Battlefield games, especially the ones that came after Battlefield 4. There was also a huge variety to choose from when it came to vehicles. We had tanks, helis, jets, attack boats, anti-air vehicles. There was something for everyone, and this was the Battlefield game that focused a lot more on naval combat too, especially with the Naval Strike DLC. It also featured a server browser, and you could actually rent servers for however many days you wanted back then, which meant you could host your own servers. It was how many communities were formed, playing on the same server and seeing the same people each day. It's something you don't see in Battlefield games now, and it started to disappear around Battlefield 1, but officially Battlefield 5 and Battlefield 24 were too. I remember having a handful of servers that I would constantly play and still play to today from time to time, and I think that's the case for many players. They were responsible for having high ticket games in Operation Locker, but could also ban certain weapons from being used that were overpowered or broken. They were the best way to play the game in a way that you wanted and enjoyed. Battlefield 4's movement system is one of the most deceptive elements of its design. At surface level, it appears grounded and weighty, but beneath this seemingly conventional surface lies an unexpectedly deep movement system, one that was used mainly by high-skilled players, and a lot of them were actually glitches that just never got fixed. Overall, the movement in Battlefield 4 felt sharper, snappier, floatier, and more responsive compared to Battlefield 3, and even Battlefield 1. You could spam crouch pretty fast whilst shooting to throw your enemies off. Bunny hopping carried over from Battlefield 3. Well, you can't really call it bunny hopping, but it was there. However, this time there was a bigger cooldown between jumps, meaning you couldn't chain them together as much. You could, however, air strafe a lot more. It would throw the enemy off, and although it wouldn't seem like you're moving that much, on the enemy screen you were moving quite a lot. You could also use it when jump peeking corners. The problem is that when you jump peek a corner and go to shoot, your aim would be off. And that's where you would switch over to a gadget or a secondary weapon, and as you jump around the corner and you're in mid-air, you switch weapons and press the crouch button twice to reset your standard animation. You could chain all of these different mechanics to really give you an advantage in a gunfight. Then we have some of the main glitches, which are called Zuzu, Muzu and Ruzu. What they do is basically make you glitch from one place to the other, or make you seem like you're sliding across the floor. I won't go over how they were done, as there's plenty of videos out there going over them, but I wouldn't really consider them the core movement mechanics of Battlefield 4 anyway, as they were glitches and the majority of the players probably still don't know about them today. I think that Battlefield 4 has the best movement mechanics, and I just loved the way that it felt overall. But that is just personal preference, and I like when a game offers some advanced movement, as I think it increases the skill gap. The only game that has done it better than Battlefield 4 in my opinion, and it's one of the few things that it's done well, was Battlefield 5. The movement in Battlefield 5 is probably the standout of that game. However, Battlefield 4's multiplayer wasn't without its problems. Netcode was a reoccurring frustration, hit detection inconsistencies, latency spikes, and you constantly kept dying once you were around the corner. If you think 2042's netcode was bad at launch, you must have never played Battlefield 4 because that shit was fucking awful. Your whole body would be behind a building and you would still die. And on the other hand, you would be shooting someone straight in the head and none of your bullets would register. Games also kept on crashing, making the game literally unplayable for most players. Remember how bad vaulting and some of the animations were? The game did eventually come around and all of these issues were fixed. Well, apart from the vaulting, because that still sucks. But Battlefield 4 also introduced a CTE, community test environment, which helped devs make sure that updates were good and nothing launched in a buggy mess. It was a huge success and is one of the reasons we have had Battlefield Labs for Battlefield 6. It almost feels like a lot of people have forgotten that this game launched in a horrific state because of how good it actually is. I guess it's a testament that under all of the issues, there was a fantastic game. The gaming landscape is slightly different back then too. Today, if a game launches in a horrific state, it's most likely never going to recover. Of course you have some exceptions, but there's only a few. And 2042 solidifies my point that first impressions are everything, which makes the fact that Battlefield 4 recovered even more surprising. Now let's talk about DLCs that Battlefield 4 offered. The first expansion, China Rising, was in many ways the least memorable of the 5. Released just a month after launch, it introduced 4 new maps set in China's mainland: Silk Road, Gullian Peaks, Dragon Pass and Altai Range. The maps themselves weren't all that great in my opinion, but it was more content. 5 new weapons were also added along with 2 new vehicles, the dirt bike and the bomber, which was used through an air raid bunker that players had to control in order to use. But perhaps the biggest issue with China Rising was that it landed during the game's most broken phase. Server crashes, bugs, rubber banding plagued the DLC's reception. As a result, China Rising struggled to leave a lasting impression. In contrast, Second Assault, which was a fan service type of DLC, remastered 4 of the most popular maps from Battlefield 3. Operation Metro, Caspian Border, Gulf of Oman and Operation Firestorm. Each map was reimagined using the Frostbite 3's engine destruction mechanics and Levolution elements. For example, Caspian Border now featured a collapsing radio tower and a far more dynamic terrain. Operation Metro, infamous for its linear choke point heavy design, now had destructible cover and more flanking opportunities, although it still remained an absolute fuckfest. These changes reinvigorated the classics and provided a welcome nostalgia hit for long-time fans. It also brought back some weapons from Battlefield 3. The F2000, Gold Magnum and the AS Val. But more importantly, it showed that DICE could look backward without stagnating. Then came Naval Strike, an expansion built entirely around naval combat, and it succeeded in pushing water-based warfare to the forefront in a way no Battlefield title had before or since. It had maps like Nansha Strike, Lost Islands, Wavebreaker and Operation Mortar. It also introduced the new mode Carrier Assault, which was a spiritual successor to Battlefield 2142's Titan mode, where teams had to destroy the opposing team's aircraft carrier by capturing objectives and eventually storming it on foot. The mode was a cool addition, although personally I still preferred Titan Assault, and overall this was probably my least favourite expansion that the game received. Then came my favourite, which was Dragon's Teeth. It focused on urban infantry combat. Its 4 maps, Lumphney Garden, Pearl Market, Sunken Dragon and Propaganda, offered tight alleyways, layered verticality and near constant action. The expansion was a dream come true for infantry focused players, and that's probably the reason why it's my favourite. It was a nice change of pace from the heavily vehicle dominated maps like Goldmund Railway. Pearl Market, with its rooftops and side streets, became a fan favourite due to its constant flow and versatile design. This expansion also added the Chainlink game mode, a twist on Conquest that emphasised holding adjacent flags to increase score multipliers. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it was still fun for a few games. Then the final expansion, Final Stand, which was perhaps the most enigmatic, teasing futuristic technology. It offered maps set in snow-covered Russian facilities and hidden research bases. The introduction of sci-fi elements like hover tanks, railguns and deployable drones was questionable. It seemed a little bit like DICE may have been testing the waters for a futuristic Battlefield. Of course they weren't, and personally I saw it more as them leaning a little bit into Battlefield 2142. It added 4 new maps and only 2 new weapons, with one of them being a pickup and the other the famous Phantom Bow. All of these expansions were of course part of Premium, which meant you had to pay for them, but then came Operations, which were a series of free content drops, with the first one dropping in summer of 2015. All this content was first tested on CTE to make sure it was smooth and had no game breaking bugs. Night Operations was the first one to drop, and it added a night version of the Zavod map. Then came Community Operations, which added the new map Operation Outbreak, which was a map created with heavy collaboration with the Battlefield community. And the last was called Legacy Operations and added Dragon Valley, a map from Battlefield 2. All of these operation expansions added a lot more longevity to the game, which was especially important after Hardline was received poorly. However, the single most important thing that saved Battlefield 4 and made it the game everyone now remembers it as was the CTE. It allowed for a number of players to test new patches and features before they were released and give feedback on them. It was responsible for fixing the wonky netcode, which led to servers having the tick rate increased, which made the overall experience feel a lot more smoother. The CTE played a huge role in making Battlefield 4 the game we love. Some of the bigger issues were already fixed beforehand, but it still played a crucial role in fixing the game and ensuring that no new expansion was released in a similar state to that of the game. One more thing that most definitely deserves a mention is the Battlefield Easter egg community and challenges that Battlefield 4 had, because few games have embraced the absurd and insane like Battlefield 4 did with its Easter eggs. What began as subtle nods and hidden clues quickly evolved into an entire subculture within the community. They were often multi-layered puzzles that demanded community-wide cooperation and sometimes months of collective decoding. In a game built on systems and spectacle, these Easter eggs became its beating heart of mystery. The most famous and ambitious was the Phantom program. Players were required to unlock hidden dog tags, complete specific in-game challenges, and enter password-protected pages on Battlelog. The level of secrecy was astonishing. Some passwords were hidden in Morse code, others in image metadata. Completing each Phantom assignment revealed a piece of a larger puzzle, culminating in the unlocking of the Phantom Bow, the bow that came with the Final Stand expansion. But the Phantom program didn't end with a simple weapon reward. The final stage required players to wear specific gear, bring particular weapons, and complete a challenge on the map Hangar 21 under nearly impossible conditions. This was an ordeal that demanded dedication, community collaboration, and a borderline obsessive commitment. It was ridiculous, but it was also brilliant. And then there was the Megalodon. For years, players had speculated about the existence of a giant shark hidden somewhere in the oceanic maps. It was a reference to the long-standing rumours from Battlefield 3 and Bad Company 2, where players claimed to hear mysterious underwater sounds or see shadows beneath the waves. DICE finally played into the myth by actually hiding a giant player-triggered Megalodon in the naval strike map Nansha Strike. By gathering 10 players around a buoy, the Megalodon would leap out the water in a cinematic moment. It didn't affect gameplay, but it didn't really need to. It felt like a gift to the community. There is no doubt that Battlefield 4 had the best Easter eggs in the whole franchise, and to this day they have not been surpassed. Battlefield 4 was never supposed to be a masterpiece. At launch it was a disaster. A broken, buggy, near unplayable mess that threatened to sink the franchise. But what followed was one of the most remarkable redemption arcs in a multiplayer game in history. Through constant patching, new content and community support, Battlefield 4 not only salvaged its reputation, it surpassed expectations and carved out a legacy that no subsequent title has matched in my opinion. Its multiplayer was chaotic and endlessly replayable. Its vehicle warfare was the best the series has seen. Its core gameplay loop was also great. Its DLCs expanded the experience rather than just extending it, and its Easter eggs gave the community something to bond over in a way few other games have. The campaign may have been forgettable, the launch may have left scars, but when taken in its final form, Battlefield 4 stands not just as a good Battlefield game, but as one of the greatest multiplayer shooters of its generation. In the years since, DICE has tried to recapture the lightning in the bottle. Battlefield 1 was amazing, but in my opinion, didn't quite scratch the itch that Battlefield 4 did. Battlefield 5, well, it's Battlefield 5. 2042, let's forget about it. None of them have managed to replicate the magic of Battlefield 4. because none of them understood what made it special. Battlefield 4 wasn't just the last great Battlefield game, it may have been the last Battlefield that truly understood what the franchise was meant to be, and for all its chaos and flaws, that understanding is what made it legendary.